expletives and invectives. Evan was 2 decades younger than his partner, a 51-year-old first response veteran with hair the color of hoarfrost that fell over her ears and rounded her skull like a helmet. Her name was Melissa Fearon, but everyone called her Missy Fearless. She ignored Evan's occasional lapses in decorum that evening because he had never before seen a gunshot wound. He'd seen his share of grisly car and snowmobile accidents, and he had in fact been with her when they found the vacationing TV producer who'd been decapitated behind the wheel of the convertible he'd rented in Boston. But that gentleman was clearly dead, not dying, and so Evan hadn't had to get too close or spend any time with the corpse. Both EMTs were volunteers who did other things for a living. Evan worked at an electrical wire factory in nearby Lisbon, and Missy taught math at the high school in Littleton. On at least 6 occasions, she had pulled her own students from their dads' toppled 4x4s or their very own Geos, Escorts, and Corollas, the vehicles inevitably crinkled like the foil wrappers that folded themselves around sticks of chewing gum. She had dealt before with audible bleeding, hemorrhaging that seems absolutely torrential, the flow not in reality making the noise of a geyser, but seeming to everyone present as if it is, and seen people, grown-ups and teenagers, and alas, children, impaled on the shards of twisted metal that once were parts of automobiles. Spencer was well into the first symptoms of shock when they arrived. He was cold and clammy and pale, and he was having great trouble breathing. Consequently, he was what Missy Fearon and her more seasoned associates referred to as a scoop and run. She and Evan did little at the edge of the garden where they found Spencer, his body half in the lupin that bordered the vegetables and half in the ugly knotted vines on which once had grown snow peas, other than apply a thick, gauzy trauma dressing to the wound and then lots of hand pressure, slip a stiff plastic cervical collar around his neck to immobilize his head, and roll him onto a backboard. Then they were off to the hospital in Hanover. Somehow Missy managed to stick a saline IV into Spencer in the ambulance while continuing to keep weight on the wound. She thought of how the EMTs sat on patients or jumped on the rolling gurneys to maintain pressure in the TV dramas, but she couldn't imagine actually doing such a thing, especially with this poor guy. She'd be sitting on jam. As for the emergency room physicians and the surgeon who, fortunately, lived within minutes of the hospital, once they had Spencer McCullough stabilized, their greatest concern was the reality that before shattering all that bone in his shoulder and upper back, the bullet had done a pretty fair job of pulverizing the brachial plexus, the network of nerves that sends signals from the spine to the arm and the hand. Recall the jello. Meaningful reconstruction was completely out of the question. Assuming they could even save Spencer's right arm, which was no guarantee, it was highly unlikely that it would ever do a whole lot more than flop at his side like a scarecrow's. Inevitably, Spencer was right-handed, and so even though he wasn't the athlete his wife was, the rotator cuff was among the least of the surgeon's problems. This would be a severe disability. Even though he worked at a desk, Missy overheard enough as she worked to get Spencer into the ambulance to understand that he was a public relations guy for some animal rights organization in New York City, and this house he was at was his mother-in-law's. It was going to be a very long time before anything came easy to him again. Once the physicians had started pumping the units and still more units of blood into him, done a chest x-ray, and gotten the only good news that Spencer McCullough's body was going to offer that evening, there was no hemorrhaging inside the thorax and a lung had not collapsed, they set to work trying to control the bleeding in his shoulder and washing out the wound. This meant, among other tasks, meticulously removing all those tiny fragments of bone, which were now little more than contaminants. It meant using a Gore-Tex sleeve that looked a bit like a miniature version of a radiator hose from a car engine to reconnect the severed arteries, and then, when they needed yet more tubing, stealing a part of a vein from his leg. Weeks later, they might do whatever reconstructive surgery they could. They might perform a nerve cable graft, taking nerves from the part of the man's leg where they had just taken a vein, so that a portion of the pudding of sheared links in the nearly invisible wires in his right shoulder might begin to grow back. Or, if necessary, they might amputate the arm. In all likelihood, it was going to be completely useless. No, it would be worse than useless. It would be a hindrance, a limp and flaccid tentacle that hung by his side, caught on counters and tabletops, and banged against him when he tried to move his body in any manner that was even remotely athletic. Still, Spencer McCullough was alive. And if someone had said to either Missy Fearon or Evan Seaver before they arrived at the house on Sugar Hill that a guy there had taken a bullet from a .30-06 a couple of inches from his heart, they both would have assumed that they could have driven from the scene to the hospital at the speed limit with their siren and two-tone switched off, because all that was going to happen when they arrived was that the body was going to be declared dead and put on ice for the M.E. Only when they had deposited Spencer at the hospital and he had been rushed into the OR did either of them have the time to voice the questions that had crossed both their minds. Why the hell was there a loaded deer rifle on the property 3.5 months before hunting season? And why, in the name of heaven, was a 12-year-old kid, the guy's own daughter for God's sake, firing pot shots into the garden on the last night in July? Part 1. The Deer. Chapter 1. The sun was up over Washington, Lafayette, and the trio of nearby cannonball-shaped mountains that were called the Three Graces, and Nan Seton, elderly but far from frail, sat sipping her morning coffee on a chaise longue on the Victorian house's wraparound porch. She noted how the sun was rising much later now than it had even 2 or 3 weeks ago. It was already the 28th or 29th of July. It disturbed her that she couldn't grab the precise date right now from the air, and her children would be arriving tomorrow, Friday. A golden retriever, old like her but not nearly so energetic, lolled near her feet on the outdoor rug. She had been on the porch close to half an hour, and even the coffee in the stove-top percolator she had brought outside with her was cold, when she heard her granddaughters pound their way down the stairs. The older girl, Charlotte, was 12. The younger one, Willow, a name that drove Grandmother crazy both for its absolute lack of any family resonance and its complete New Age inanity, was 10. The girls collapsed into the 2 wicker chairs near the outdoor table opposite their grandmother and her chaise. She saw they both had sleep in their eyes and their hair wasn't brushed. They were still in their nightgowns, their feet were bare, and Charlotte was sitting in such a fashion, the sole of one foot wedged against her other leg's thigh, that her nightgown had bunched up near her waist and she was offering anyone who cared to see an altogether indelicate and, in Nan's opinion, appalling show of flesh. "Good morning," she said to them, trying hard to resist the urge to put down her cup and saucer and pull Charlotte's nightgown back down over her knee. "How are my 2 little wildflowers?" "Sleepy," Charlotte said, her voice already the uninterested drawl of an urban teenager. "You girls are up early. Any special reason?" "There's a bird on the roof," Charlotte said. "A woodpecker," Willow added, and she reached down to pet the drowsing dog. Nan nodded. She decided the bird must have been on the roof over the kitchen porch on the other side of the house, because otherwise she, too, would have heard him just now. "They don't normally drum this late in the season," she said to her granddaughters. "They